I never thought a bank statement could make me throw up, but there I was at 18, hunched over the toilet in our guest bathroom, retching until nothing came up but bile and betrayal. The paper was still clutched in my trembling hand, the numbers burned into my retinas like they'd been branded there, $0.00. My entire college fund, 4 years of babysitting money, birthday checks from grandparents, and my dad's solemn promises, all reduced to a digital nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The account my father had opened for me when I was 5, the one he'd shown me every birthday as the numbers climbed higher, the one that was supposed to secure my future at Northwestern University, was completely empty, drained, vanished as if 18 years of dreams had never existed at all. My name is Emma Chen, and I suppose my story really begins the day I decided to check my college fund balance before meeting with Northwestern's financial aid office. It was supposed to be a routine verification, a simple confirmation that yes, I had the $68,000 my father had always assured me was sitting safely in that account, earning interest, waiting for my acceptance letter to arrive. I'd been accepted early admission to Northwestern's journalism program, my dream school since I was 14, and started writing for our high school newspaper. The acceptance letter had arrived 3 weeks earlier, thick and promising, with congratulations and course catalogs and all the beautiful bureaucracy of a future I'd worked so hard to earn. My grades were stellar, my extracurriculars impressive, my essays apparently compelling enough to warrant a spot in one of the most competitive programs in the country. But Northwestern was expensive, prohibitively so for a middle-class family like ours, which was why that college fund had always been my lifeline. My father, David Chen, had hammered the importance of it into my head since childhood. Every dollar I earned babysitting the Morrison twins down the street went into that account. Every $20 bill from Grandma Rose's birthday cards, every Christmas check from my Uncle Tom, all of it carefully deposited with ceremonial importance. My father was a meticulous man, an accountant by trade, who treated numbers like scripture and financial planning like a sacred duty. He'd shown me the statements quarterly since I was old enough to understand what compound interest meant, explaining how my money was growing, how every deposit was an investment in my future. He'd made spreadsheets projecting exactly how much would be available by my senior year, factoring in different interest rates and additional contributions. According to his calculations, which he'd updated just 6 months earlier, I should have had enough to cover at least 3 years of tuition, room and board. The 4th year, he'd explained with his characteristic confidence, would be manageable through student loans or scholarships I'd surely earn by then. That's why the zero balance felt like more than just missing money. It felt like the ground falling away beneath my feet, like discovering that gravity had been a lie all along. I printed the statement 3 times, convinced the bank's website was malfunctioning. I logged out and logged back in, cleared my browser cache, even tried accessing the account from my phone. But the numbers remained stubbornly, impossibly consistent, $0.00, with a final withdrawal dated just 2 weeks earlier. The entire balance, transferred out in a single transaction to an account I didn't recognize. The bathroom tiles were cold against my knees as I tried to process what I was seeing. $68,437. Gone. Just gone. The number was so specific, it somehow made the loss feel more real, more concrete than if it had been a round figure. $68,437 represented every sacrifice I'd made. Every Friday night I'd spent babysitting instead of going to movies with friends, every birthday where I'd asked for money instead of gifts. My phone buzzed against the bathroom counter where I'd left it, and I saw a text from my best friend Sarah, asking if I wanted to grab coffee before our AP chemistry study session. The normalcy of it, the assumption that my life was still the same as it had been an hour ago, made my stomach clench again. I couldn't tell her. Not yet, not until I understood what had happened, until I could make sense of the impossible math in front of me. Sarah knew how important Northwestern was to me, how central that college fund was to my plans. She'd been there the day I'd gotten my acceptance letter, screaming with joy in the school parking lot until Mr. Peterson had shushed us from his classroom window. Instead, I texted back that I couldn't make it, that I was feeling sick. It wasn't a lie. I was sick, nauseated by the implications of what I'd discovered, by the growing certainty that this wasn't a bank error or a system glitch. My father wasn't home. He rarely was during tax season, spending long hours at his firm, helping panicked clients sort through shoebox receipts and medical deductions. My mother, Linda, was at her job at the pediatric clinic, where she worked as a nurse practitioner. The house felt enormous and echoey around me as I made my way to my father's home office, the bank statement still crumpled in my fist. His office was a monument to organization, everything in its place according to systems he'd refined over decades. File cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with years and categories in his precise block lettering. His desk was clear except for his computer, a cup of pens arranged by color, and a small stack of client folders perfectly aligned with the edge of his desk pad. I'd been in this office thousands of times, usually for homework help or to use his printer when mine ran out of ink. But I'd never sat in his chair before, never opened his computer without permission. The leather seat still held the impression of his body, and I felt like an intruder as I powered on his desktop and waited for it to load. I didn't know his password, but I didn't need to access his computer to find what I was looking for. His filing system was legendary in our family, a source of both pride and gentle mockery. If there were records of my college fund transactions, they'd be in the filing cabinet marked with my name. The drawer slid open easily, revealing manila folders organized chronologically from my birth certificate to my most recent report card. The college fund folder was thick, bulging with years of deposit slips and quarterly statements. I pulled it out with shaking hands and spread the contents across his desk. The pattern was clear and heartbreaking in its consistency. Deposits ranging from $20 to several hundred, each one carefully documented and filed. Birthday money, babysitting earnings, small gifts from relatives, all accumulating steadily over the years. The statements showed the balance growing predictably, compound interest adding its modest magic to my savings. Until 6 months ago. The statements from the past half year told a different story entirely. Small withdrawals at first, a few $100s here and there, then larger amounts. The most recent statement, dated just 3 weeks ago, showed the devastating final transaction, a transfer of $63,212 to an account number I didn't recognize, leaving only a few thousand behind. But there was more. Stuck to the back of the most recent statement was a sticky note in my father's handwriting, barely legible scrawl that was so unlike his usual careful penmanship. Temporary loan will replace before fall semester. Em understands the situation. Em, my father's girlfriend, Melissa Rodriguez. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins. My father had been dating Melissa for 8 months, ever since they'd met at a client appreciation dinner last spring. She was 10 years younger than him, recently divorced, with 2 young children, and what my mother had acidly described as expensive taste and poor judgment. The introduction of Melissa into our family had been a source of tension that none of us talked about directly. My parents had been divorced for 3 years, their separation amicable enough that they still had dinner together occasionally, and presented a united front for my benefit. But my father's relationship with Melissa felt different from the casual dating he'd done since the divorce. More serious, more consuming, and apparently more expensive than any of us had realized. I thought about the gifts I'd seen him giving her. The jewelry that seemed too elaborate for their relatively new relationship, the weekend trips they'd started taking together, the shopping bags from high-end stores that appeared in his car when he picked me up for our monthly dinners. I'd assumed he was just trying to impress her, that he was going through some kind of midlife dating phase that would eventually settle into something more reasonable. I'd never imagined he was funding it with my college money. The sticky note felt like evidence of a crime as I held it up to the light, trying to parse the implications of his words. Temporary loan suggested he'd planned to pay it back, that he'd convinced himself this was just borrowing against my future, rather than stealing from it. Will replace before fall semester indicated he understood the timeline, that he knew exactly when I'd need the money, and had calculated he could make it right before then. But it was the final phrase that made my hands shake with rage. Em understands the situation. He'd told her, he'd explained to his girlfriend, that he was taking his daughter's college fund to pay for whatever lifestyle they'd been living, and she'd been okay with it. She'd understood the situation, and let him do it anyway. I photographed every document with my phone, building my own digital case file, while the physical evidence lay scattered across his desk. The deposit slips showing years of my own contributions, the statements tracking the recent hemorrhaging of funds, the sticky note that proved this wasn't some administrative error or investment gone wrong. By the time I finished documenting everything, the afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the office. I carefully returned all the papers to their folder and slid the drawer closed, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the room. I sat in my father's chair, staring at his computer screensaver, a cycling slideshow of family photos that now felt like evidence of a different life entirely. There was a picture of my 8th grade graduation, where I'd won the Academic Achievement Award, and my father had been so proud he'd made the photographer take 6 different shots. Another from last Christmas, when we'd all gathered at my grandmother's house and pretended that divorce had made us closer rather than just more careful around each other. A photo from my 16th birthday, when he'd surprised me with a car, used but reliable, with a giant bow he'd somehow managed to attach to the roof. Looking at these images now, I wondered how many of them had been funded by money that should have been mine. Had my birthday car come from my college fund? The family vacation to Yellowstone last summer? The expensive dinners he'd insisted on paying for when we spent time together? The front door slammed, echoing through the house, and I heard my mother's voice calling my name. I quickly closed the file folder and left the office, trying to compose my face into something that wouldn't immediately reveal the magnitude of what I'd discovered. "Emma, you're home early. I thought you had study group today." My mother appeared in the hallway, still in her scrubs from the clinic, her hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she wore for 12-hour shifts. "I wasn't feeling well," I said, which was becoming more true by the hour. "Mom, can I ask you something about Dad's finances?" Her expression shifted, the casual concern of a parent checking on a sick child, replaced by something more guarded. "What kind of question? Do you know anything about my college fund? Has Dad mentioned anything about it recently?" She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the intensity she usually reserved for patients she was trying to diagnose. "Why don't you sit down, sweetheart?" We ended up in the kitchen, the same space where we'd celebrated my Northwestern acceptance just 3 weeks earlier. My mother made tea, her movements automatic and precise, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped the kettle handle a little too tightly. "Your father called me last week," she said finally, setting a mug in front of me. "He wanted to discuss some concerns about your college expenses." My heart sank. What kind of concerns? "He said there might be some delays in accessing your fund, something about investment vehicles and market conditions." She wrapped her hands around her own mug, using it as a shield between us. "He asked if I could help bridge any gaps in funding for your first semester." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I'd do whatever I could to help, but that my savings are limited." The divorce settlement was fair, but it wasn't generous. She looked up at me, and I could see the worry she'd been trying to hide. "Emma, is there something specific you're concerned about?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the bank statement, the devastating zero balance that had started this whole investigation. Her face went white as she processed the numbers, her nurse's training probably calculating the implications faster than I had. "Oh honey," her voice was barely a whisper. "Oh Emma, I'm so sorry, you didn't know." She shook her head, still staring at the phone screen. I knew he'd been spending more money lately, that this relationship with Melissa seemed expensive, but I never imagined. She trailed off, then looked up at me, with an expression I'd never seen before. Fury mixed with determination, the look of a mother who'd just discovered someone had hurt her child. "We're calling him right now," she said, reaching for her phone. "This is unacceptable. This is your future he's playing with." But when she dialed his number, it went straight to voicemail. She tried his office line and got his assistant, who said he'd left early for a dentist appointment and wouldn't be back until tomorrow. We both knew it was tax season, when my father practically lived at his office.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"He didn't take time off for dentist appointments during tax season. He's avoiding us," my mother said, her voice tight with anger. "He knows we've found out." We spent the next 2 hours trying to reach him, calling his cell phone, his office, even trying Melissa's number that I found in his contact list on the family computer. Everything went to voicemail, a wall of silence that felt intentional and cruel. Finally, around 7 o'clock, my mother's phone buzzed with a text message from my father. "Working late tonight, we'll call Emma tomorrow to discuss college planning. Everything will work out." The casual tone of it, the assumption that this could be resolved with a phone call and some vague promises, made me want to throw my mother's phone against the wall. Everything would work out. As if 18 years of saving could be dismissed with corporate speak and false reassurance. "I'm driving to his apartment," I announced, grabbing my car keys from the bowl by the front door. "Emma, wait." My mother caught my arm. "Maybe we should think this through, approach it strategically." "What's to think through?" "He stole my college money. I want to know why, and I want to know how he's going to fix it. And if he can't fix it? If the money is gone and can't be recovered?" Her question hung in the air between us, naming the fear I'd been trying not to acknowledge. "Then I need to know that too," I said quietly. "I need to know what I'm dealing with so I can figure out what to do next." The drive to my father's apartment complex took 20 minutes through rush hour traffic, 20 minutes of rehearsing what I would say when I confronted him. I imagined calm, rational conversations where he explained everything and produced a plan to make it right. I imagined explosive arguments where I finally told him exactly what I thought of his choices. I imagined him breaking down and admitting he'd made a terrible mistake, begging for forgiveness while promising to fix everything. But what I found when I arrived was something I hadn't prepared for at all. My father's apartment building was one of those newer complexes, designed to look luxurious while remaining affordable. All granite countertops and stainless steel appliances arranged in spaces too small for the lifestyle they were meant to suggest. He'd moved there after the divorce, claiming he needed somewhere temporary while he figured out his next step. 3 years later, he was still there, still talking about it as a temporary arrangement. I'd been to his apartment dozens of times, but tonight it felt different as I rode the elevator to the 3rd floor. Tonight I was no longer his daughter seeking homework help or sharing a pizza while we watched movies. Tonight I was someone who'd been wronged, someone seeking answers and accountability. The hallway was carpeted in industrial beige and smelled faintly of other people's cooking. I stood outside apartment 3B for a full minute, gathering my courage and trying to decide whether to knock or use the key he'd given me for emergencies. This felt like an emergency, but not the kind he'd had in mind when he'd handed over that spare key. I knocked. 3 firm raps that echoed more loudly than I'd expected in the narrow hallway. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and pressed my ear to the door. I could hear music playing inside, something soft and jazzy that my father never listened to when I was around. There were voices too, conversation and laughter that sounded relaxed and intimate. He was home. He was home with Melissa, probably having a nice dinner while my entire future crumbled around the empty bank account they'd created together. I used my key. The door swung open to reveal my father's living room, which had been transformed since my last visit. New furniture arranged around a dining table I'd never seen before, set with dishes that definitely hadn't come from Target. Candles flickered on every surface, and the smell of expensive wine hung in the air like an accusation. My father appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, a dish towel in his hands, and an expression of absolute horror on his face when he saw me standing in his entryway. "Emma," his voice cracked on my name. "Sweetheart, what are you doing here?" Behind him, Melissa emerged from the kitchen, elegant in a way that suggested she'd dressed for this dinner like it was an event. Her dark hair was styled in loose waves, and she wore a dress that probably cost more than I made in 2 months of babysitting. When she saw me, her face didn't show surprise or guilt. She looked annoyed, like I was an uninvited guest disrupting a party. "I came to talk to you about my college fund," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "The one that used to have $68,000 in it until 2 weeks ago." The dish towel slipped from my father's hands, landing on the hardwood floor between us. In the silence that followed, I could hear the jazz music still playing in the background, upbeat and cheerful, and completely inappropriate for the moment that was unfolding. "Emma, let me explain." My father started, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I saw the statements. I saw your note about the temporary loan. I know exactly what happened." I looked past him to Melissa, who was standing with her arms crossed, still looking more irritated than ashamed. "What I want to know is why you thought you had the right to spend my money on whatever this is." I gestured around the apartment, taking in the expensive dinner, the new furniture, the obvious effort that had gone into creating this romantic evening. The candles alone probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. It's not what you think, my father said, but his words sounded hollow even to him. I was going to pay it back before you needed it. I have a plan. What plan? What possible plan could justify taking my entire college fund without even telling me? Melissa stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that surprised me. Emma, you're being dramatic. Your father is an accountant. He knows how to manage money better than an 18-year-old girl. He was investing your fund in opportunities that would have generated much better returns than whatever basic savings account you had. The casual dismissal in her tone, the implication that I was too young and stupid to understand financial planning made something inside me snap. Investing it in what? Your jewelry. This furniture, whatever five-star restaurants you've been eating at while I've been working weekends to add to that fund. My voice was rising, but I couldn't bring myself to care. And what gives you the right to have an opinion about my money anyway? Emma, please lower your voice, my father said, glancing nervously toward the walls, probably worried about what the neighbors might think. No, I will not lower my voice. I will not pretend this is a reasonable conversation about investment strategies. You stole from me, Dad. You stole my future and gave it to her, and now you want me to be quiet about it so your neighbors don't hear. Melissa laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the room like glass breaking. Stole, that's really what you're going with. Your father provided for you for 18 years. He put a roof over your head, food on your table, clothes on your back, and now when he needs some support during a transitional period in his life, you want to call it stealing. The logic was so twisted, so completely removed from any reasonable understanding of parent-child relationships, that I felt like I was listening to someone speak a foreign language. He put money aside for my education, money that included my own earnings, and then he took it without asking to fund his relationship with you. How is that not stealing? Because it's his money, she said simply. He's the parent. You're the child. When you're an adult with your own career and your own responsibilities, then you can make decisions about investments and loans and financial planning. Until then, you trust the adults in your life to make the best decisions for everyone involved. I looked at my father, waiting for him to correct her, to explain that she was wrong about how our family worked, about what our relationship meant. But he just stood there, the dish towel still on the floor at his feet, looking like he wished he could disappear entirely. Is that what you think? I asked him directly, that this was your money to take. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I thought I could fix it before you found out. I thought I could make it work. But you don't think you did anything wrong. Another long pause. I think I made some poor choices about timing and communication. Poor choices about timing and communication. As if the problem was that he'd been caught rather than that he'd betrayed 18 years of trust and promises. I felt something break inside me then, some fundamental faith in the people who were supposed to protect me. Not just the money, though that was devastating enough. But the realization that my father could look me in the eye and reduce this betrayal to poor communication, that he could let his girlfriend tell me I was being dramatic for expecting my college fund to actually exist when I needed it. I'm going to Northwestern, I said quietly. I don't know how yet, but I'm going, and I'm never trusting you with anything important ever again. I turned to leave, but Melissa's voice stopped me at the door. Good luck with that, she said, her tone suggesting she found my determination amusing rather than admirable. College is expensive, Emma. Maybe you should consider community college for a few years while you save up for the real thing. I turned back to look at her, this woman who had never contributed $1 to my education but felt entitled to spend money I'd been saving since I was 5 years old. She was smiling, not cruel exactly, but satisfied in a way that made me understand she knew exactly what she'd done, and felt no regret about it whatsoever. You know what's interesting, Melissa? I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. I've been working and saving since I was 13 years old. I've never expected anyone to hand me anything I hadn't earned. But you're 42 years old, and you just spent 4 years of a teenager's college money on whatever this lifestyle is supposed to be. Which one of us sounds more prepared for the real world? Her smile faltered, but before she could respond, I was out the door and heading for the elevator, my hands shaking so hard I could barely press the button. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, crying angry tears and trying to process what had just happened. Not just the confirmation that my money was gone, though that was terrible enough, but the casual cruelty of it, the way Melissa had dismissed my future like it was an inconvenience to their present. The way my father had stood there and let her talk to me like I was an ungrateful child for expecting the promises he'd made to mean something. My phone buzzed with a text message from him. "Emma, please come back upstairs so we can discuss this calmly." I deleted it without responding. Another message arrived a few minutes later. "I know you're upset, but this situation is more complicated than you understand. Let me explain the full picture." I deleted that one too. The third message came as I was driving home. "Melissa and I are getting married next month. We wanted to tell you together, in a better setting. The expenses you're upset about were wedding and honeymoon costs, investments in our future as a family. I hope you can find it in your heart to be happy for us." I had to pull over to the side of the road because my hands were shaking too hard to drive safely. They were getting married
Next month, and they'd used my college fund to pay for their wedding. The phone rang almost immediately, my father calling to gauge my reaction to his announcement. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message with a growing sense of unreality. "Sweetheart, I know this is a lot to process all at once. The marriage, the college fund situation, everything happening so quickly, but Melissa is going to be part of our family now, and I really hope you can accept that and move forward together. Call me back when you're ready to talk about solutions instead of just being angry." Solutions. As if there were simple fixes for betrayal, easy answers for broken trust. As if I should congratulate him on his upcoming marriage to the woman who'd helped him spend my future. I drove home in a daze, my mind cycling through the events of the evening like a broken record. The candlelit dinner, the expensive furniture, Melissa's casual dismissal of my concerns, my father's refusal to acknowledge what he'd actually done. The engagement announcement delivered like it was supposed to be good news that would outweigh the devastation of my empty bank account. My mother was waiting in the kitchen when I walked in, still in her scrubs but with her hair down now, a glass of wine in her hands and an expression that suggested she'd been preparing for bad news. "How did it go?" she asked quietly. I told her everything, the dinner party I'd interrupted, the conversation with Melissa, the casual way they'd dismissed my concerns, the engagement announcement that had felt like salt in an open wound. My mother listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring into her wine glass like it might contain answers. $68,000, she said finally. 18 years of saving, gone in 8 months. And they're getting married next month. Apparently I was funding their wedding. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course they are. Of course the timeline works out exactly like that. Mom, what am I going to do? Northwestern expects a deposit by May 1st, and classes start in August. Even if I could get loans to cover everything, which I probably can't without a cosigner, the paperwork alone would take months to process. We'll figure something out, she said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Maybe you could defer for a year, reapply for next fall while we sort this out legally. Legally, Emma, what your father did isn't just morally wrong. Depending on how that account was set up, it might actually be illegal. If you were listed as a beneficiary or co-owner, he could be charged with theft. The idea hadn't occurred to me, and I felt a strange mix of hope and dread at the possibility. Do you think that would actually work? Could we get the money back? I don't know, but I think we need to find out what our options are. She finished her wine and set the glass down with more force than necessary. Your father has always been careful about legal details. If he took that money, he probably made sure he had the right to do it technically, even if it was wrong morally. She was right, of course. My father was an accountant, someone who understood fine print and legal loopholes better than most people. He wouldn't have risked criminal charges for wedding expenses, no matter how expensive they were. But that didn't mean I was out of options entirely. I'm going to call Northwestern tomorrow, I said. Explain the situation and see if there's any flexibility in their policies. Maybe they have emergency aid programs or something. That's a good idea, and I'm going to call a lawyer, see what kind of recourse we might have. Even if we can't get criminal charges to stick, there might be civil options. We sat in the kitchen for another hour, making lists of people to call and steps to take, but underneath the planning was a growing recognition that this might not have a happy ending. Even if we could prove my father had acted illegally, even if we could get a judgment against him, that didn't mean the money still existed to be recovered. If he'd spent $68,000 on wedding expenses and furniture and jewelry, if it was already gone rather than invested somewhere recoverable, then all the legal victories in the world wouldn't pay my tuition. For the first time since I'd seen that bank statement, I let myself really consider the possibility that Northwestern might not happen. That 4 years of perfect grades and extracurricular activities and careful planning might not be enough if the financial foundation had been swept away. The thought made me feel sick all over again, but it also sparked something else. Anger, yes, but also determination. My father and Melissa had made their choices, had decided that their wants mattered more than my future. But I wasn't powerless here. I wasn't just a victim of their selfishness. I was 18 years old, legally an adult, with a brain that had earned admission to one of the best journalism programs in the country. I had options they probably hadn't considered, resources they might not know about, and a level of motivation they'd just created by stealing from me. If they thought this would break me, if they expected me to quietly accept community college and give up my dreams, they were about to learn they'd seriously underestimated who they were dealing with. I was Emma Chen, and I had work to do. The Northwestern University financial aid office smelled like industrial carpet and broken dreams. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning, clutching a folder full of documentation that told the story of my family's financial catastrophe in neat bureaucratic terms. Bank statements, legal affidavits, correspondence with my father's attorney, all of it adding up to one simple truth: I had no money for college, and I needed help. The financial aid counselor assigned to my case was a woman named Janet Morrison, who looked like she'd been delivering bad news to hopeful students for at least 20 years. She had the practiced sympathy of someone who'd seen every sob story, heard every excuse, and learned to maintain professional distance from the human wreckage that passed through her office daily. "Miss Chen," she said, reviewing my file with methodical precision, "I understand your situation is quite unusual. Typically, when we see sudden changes in family financial circumstances, it's due to job loss or medical emergencies, not—" She paused, clearly searching for a diplomatic way to phrase it, "not misappropriation of funds by a parent. My father stole my college money to pay for his wedding," I said bluntly. "There's really no need to sugarcoat it." Janet's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in her professional facade. "Yes, well, the challenge we're facing is that our emergency aid programs are designed for temporary hardships with clear resolution timelines. A student loses a parent's job, we can provide bridge funding until employment is secured. A family faces unexpected medical bills, we can restructure aid packages to accommodate new circumstances." She set my file down and looked at me directly. "But in your case, the funds that were taken may never be recovered. Even if your family pursues legal action successfully, that process could take years. We can't hold a spot in our incoming class indefinitely while litigation proceeds." I'd been prepared for this response, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly still felt like a punch to the stomach. "What are my options?" "You could defer admission for 1 year, while you pursue other funding sources. Scholarships, private loans, family assistance. Some students work for a gap year to build savings, though $68,000 would require quite exceptional employment. Or you could accept admission, but acknowledge that you'll need to secure alternative funding very quickly. Federal loans would cover perhaps half your expenses, assuming you qualify without a cosigner. Private loans would require either collateral or a cosigner with excellent credit." I thought about my mother's modest savings, depleted by the divorce, and her decision to help me with expenses my father had promised to cover. My grandparents lived on fixed incomes, generous with birthday checks, but hardly positioned to underwrite a Northwestern education. My Uncle Tom had his own kids approaching college age. What about work-study programs? Could I increase my hours, take on multiple jobs? Janet's expression softened slightly, and I realized I was asking questions she'd answered countless times before. Work-study programs are capped at 20 hours per week during the academic year, and they typically pay minimum wage. Even working the maximum hours, you'd earn perhaps $4,000 annually. That's a fraction of what you'd need. The math was brutal in its simplicity. Northwestern's annual cost was approaching $70,000 when room, board, and fees were included. Federal loans might cover $30,000, work-study could add $4,000. That left a gap of over $35,000 per year, money I simply didn't have and couldn't realistically earn. There is one other possibility, Janet said carefully. It's unconventional, and I want to be clear that it's not something the university officially recommends. I leaned forward, desperate for any option that didn't involve abandoning my dreams entirely. Some students in extraordinary circumstances have found success with crowdfunding campaigns. Online fundraising to cover educational expenses. It requires significant effort and media savvy, and there's no guarantee of success, but for students with compelling stories. She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood, my story was certainly compelling. The hard-working daughter whose future was stolen by her father's selfishness, fighting to overcome betrayal and achieve her dreams anyway. It was the kind of narrative that might resonate with strangers on the internet, the modern equivalent of passing a hat for someone in need. How would something like that work? You'd need to create a campaign on one of the major platforms, tell your story effectively, and promote it through social media and local news coverage. Some students have raised significant amounts, particularly when their stories gain traction with larger audiences. She handed me a business card with several website addresses written on the back. These are the most reputable platforms for educational fundraising. If you decide to pursue this route, I'd recommend focusing on the facts of your situation, rather than emotional appeals. People respond to concrete goals and transparent use of funds. I left the financial aid office with a mixture of hope and dread. Crowdfunding felt like begging, like admitting that my family's dysfunction was entertainment for strangers who might or might not decide I was worthy of their charity. But it was also the first realistic path forward I'd heard since discovering my empty bank account. The next 3 days were a crash course in digital storytelling and social media strategy. I researched successful education crowdfunding campaigns, studying how other students had presented their stories, what kinds of proof and documentation donors expected, how to structure funding goals and timeline. Most successful campaigns shared common elements: clear, factual storytelling without excessive self-pity, specific financial goals with detailed breakdowns of expenses, regular updates showing progress toward educational milestones, and some kind of personal connection or unique angle that made the story memorable. My angle was obvious but difficult to articulate without sounding like I was seeking sympathy rather than support. The challenge was presenting my father's betrayal as context for my need without making the entire campaign about family drama rather than educational opportunity. I spent hours crafting and recrafting the campaign description, trying to strike the right balance between honesty and dignity. The final version was shorter than my initial drafts, focused on facts rather than emotions. My name is Emma Chen, and I've been accepted to Northwestern University's journalism program after years of academic achievement and careful financial planning. Since age 5, my family maintained a college fund that grew to $68,000 through my own earnings, family contributions, and compound interest. 2 weeks before I needed to confirm my enrollment, I discovered that my father had withdrawn the entire balance to pay for wedding expenses related to his new marriage. Legal consultation has confirmed that while his actions were morally reprehensible, they were technically legal under the account structure. I'm seeking community support to replace this funding and pursue my educational goals despite this betrayal of trust. The description continued with specific details about Northwestern's costs, my academic achievements, and my plan to supplement crowdfunding with work-study employment and federal loans. I included documentation of my acceptance letter, my academic transcripts, and the empty bank statements that proved my story. Setting the funding goal required careful calculation. I needed enough to cover 4 years of expenses that crowdfunding could reasonably address, but not so much that the target seemed impossible. After consulting with Janet Morrison and reviewing other successful campaigns, I settled on $45,000, enough to cover the gap between federal aid and actual costs for my first 2 years. The logic was that once I was enrolled and performing well academically, I'd have access to additional scholarship opportunities, and could potentially renew the crowdfunding campaign for my final 2 years, with a track record of success to point to. Launching the campaign felt like jumping off a cliff. I published it on a Thursday evening, then spent the weekend promoting it through every social media platform I could access, every personal connection I could reasonably ask for support. I sent the link to extended family, friends from high school, teachers who'd mentored me, even casual acquaintances who might be willing to share it with their own networks. The first few days were encouraging.
Family and friends contributed quickly, often with messages of support that meant as much as the financial help. My Aunt Sarah shared the campaign on her Facebook page with a post about family loyalty and educational opportunity that generated dozens of small donations from her friends and colleagues. My high school journalism teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, not only donated but also shared the campaign with the local newspaper editor she knew, suggesting it might be worth a feature story. The possibility of local media coverage was both exciting and terrifying, the chance to reach a much larger audience balanced against the prospect of making my family's dysfunction a matter of public record. By the end of the first week, I'd raised almost $3,000 from about 60 donors. The vast majority were small contributions, $20 or $50 from people who probably couldn't afford much but wanted to help anyway. A few larger donations came from family friends who'd known me since childhood and felt invested in my success, but I was also learning that successful crowdfunding required constant promotion and engagement. I needed to post regular updates, respond to comments and questions, share the campaign repeatedly without annoying people who'd already contributed. It was essentially a part-time job on top of finishing my senior year and working my regular babysitting schedule. The breakthrough came when the local newspaper editor, Maria Santos, called me directly to discuss a potential feature story. She'd reviewed my campaign and was interested in the broader issues it raised about college affordability and family financial responsibility. "This isn't just your story," she explained during our phone conversation. "It's representative of larger problems affecting students across the country. College costs rising faster than family incomes, parents unprepared for the financial realities of higher education, kids caught in the middle when families implode." The interview took place at a coffee shop near my high school, a surreal experience of explaining my family's most painful moments to a stranger who took notes and asked follow-up questions with professional detachment. Maria was kind but thorough, asking for details I hadn't included in my campaign, verification of claims I'd made, perspective on how this experience had affected my relationship with my father. That last question was particularly difficult to answer honestly. I hadn't spoken to my father since the confrontation at his apartment 2 weeks earlier. He'd sent several text messages that I'd ignored, attempting to frame our conflict as a misunderstanding that could be resolved through mature conversation. His latest message had included an invitation to his wedding, as if I might suddenly decide that celebrating his marriage to the woman who'd helped him spend my college money was an appropriate response to the situation. "I don't think he understands what he's actually done," I told Maria. "He keeps talking about poor communication and timing issues, as if the problem is that he got caught rather than that he betrayed 18 years of promises and trust. Have you considered that he might genuinely believe he can pay the money back? That this was intended as a short-term loan rather than permanent theft?" The question forced me to examine motivations I'd been trying not to think about. Maybe he believed that initially. But even if he could pay it back eventually, he took it without asking and spent it knowing I'd need it in September. The intent doesn't matter when the impact is that I can't afford college. The newspaper story published on a Wednesday morning, accompanied by a photo of me studying in the high school library and a sidebar explaining how readers could contribute to my campaign. The headline was simple and effective: "Local student seeks community help after college fund disappears." The response was immediate and overwhelming. My campaign received over 200 new donations in the first 24 hours after the article appeared, including several large contributions from local business owners and community organizations. The total raised jumped from $3,000 to nearly $15,000 practically overnight. But the media attention also brought scrutiny I hadn't anticipated.
The newspaper's online comment section became a battlefield of opinions about family responsibility, student entitlement, and the appropriateness of public fundraising for private problems. While many commenters were supportive, others questioned why I deserved community assistance when plenty of students worked their way through college without help. More concerning were the attempts by some readers to contact my father directly, apparently located through public records and social media searches. He called me for the first time since our confrontation, furious about what he described as my attempt to publicly humiliate him and his fiancée. "You've turned this into a circus," he said, his voice tight with anger I'd rarely heard from him. "Dragging our family's private business through the newspaper like some kind of tabloid story. Our family's private business became my public problem when you spent my college money," I replied. "I'm trying to solve that problem the only way I can. By making me look like a criminal. By encouraging strangers to judge decisions they don't understand." The conversation devolved from there, with my father accusing me of vindictive behavior and me pointing out that he'd created this situation through his own choices. It ended with him threatening to contact the newspaper to correct the record about what had actually happened, a threat that worried me more than I wanted to admit. If he could somehow reframe the story, if he could present evidence that I was lying or exaggerating or misrepresenting the situation, it could destroy not only my crowdfunding campaign, but also my credibility with Northwestern's financial aid office. I called Maria Santos immediately after hanging up with my father, explaining his threat and asking what kind of fact-checking the newspaper had done before publishing the story. "We verified your enrollment at Northwestern, confirmed the existence and emptying of the college fund, and reviewed the basic timeline of events," she said. "Unless your father has documentation that contradicts those facts, there's not much he can dispute without looking petty. But what if he tries anyway? What if he gives you a different version of events? Then we'd investigate his claims just like we investigated yours. But Emma, the truth is that your story is well documented and your father's motivations for disputing it are obvious. He's facing social consequences for choices he made, and that's uncomfortable for him, but it doesn't change the facts." Her reassurance helped, but I still spent the next few days anxiously monitoring my campaign and email for signs that my father had carried through on his threat. Instead, what happened was even more unexpected. Melissa called me. I almost didn't answer when her number appeared on my phone, but curiosity won out over caution. "Emma, I think we need to talk," she said without preamble. "This situation has gotten out of hand, and I have some things to tell you that might change how you see what happened. I know exactly what happened. You and my father spent my college money on your wedding and lifestyle, and now you're facing the consequences of that choice. It's more complicated than that. Can we meet somewhere? I have information about your father's financial situation that I think you should know before this goes any further." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at the same coffee shop where I'd done the newspaper interview. The irony wasn't lost on me, returning to the scene where I'd told my story publicly to now hear whatever version Melissa wanted to present privately. She arrived precisely on time, dressed more casually than I'd ever seen her, but still with the careful attention to appearance that seemed to be her default mode. She looked tired, older somehow, as if the past few weeks had aged her in ways that expensive skincare couldn't prevent. "Thank you for coming," she said, settling into the chair across from me with a large coffee and what appeared to be genuine nervousness. "I know you have every reason to hate me, and I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or understanding. I'm here because there are things about this situation that you don't know, and they might affect how you proceed." I waited, letting her set the pace of whatever conversation she'd initiated. "Your father didn't tell you about his gambling problem." The words hung in the air between us, so unexpected that I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly. "What gambling problem?" "He's been gambling online for about 2 years. Poker, sports betting, some kind of cryptocurrency trading that he convinced himself was investing rather than gambling. By the time I found out about it 6 months ago, he'd already lost about $40,000. I stared at her, trying to process this information against everything I thought I knew about my father. He was cautious with money, methodical, the kind of person who researched major purchases for weeks before buying anything. The idea of him gambling away thousands of dollars seemed as unlikely as discovering he'd joined a circus. "I don't believe you. I can show you the statements if you want." When I found out, I made him promise to stop and to let me manage our joint finances until he could prove he had it under control. "That's when he started taking money from your college fund. The timeline she was suggesting made a horrible kind of sense. My father's increased spending on their relationship hadn't been about impressing her or funding a lavish lifestyle. It had been about replacing money he'd already lost, maintaining the appearance of financial stability while his actual situation crumbled beneath him. So the wedding expenses were just cover. He was really using my money to pay gambling debts. Some of both. The wedding is real, and it is expensive, but not $68,000 expensive. Most of your money went to covering losses and keeping his business accounts current, so his clients wouldn't find out about his financial problems. Melissa pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots of online betting accounts, bank transfers, credit card statements that painted a picture of systematic financial self-destruction. The amounts were staggering, money lost in increments that individually seemed manageable, but collectively represented a devastating hemorrhage of resources. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I think you deserve to know the truth, even if it doesn't change anything practically. And because I'm leaving him." That revelation was almost as shocking as the gambling disclosure. "You're calling off the wedding." "I'm calling off everything. I can't marry someone who lies about money, who steals from his own daughter to cover his addictions. I can't trust him with my children's future when he's already destroyed yours." She looked down at her coffee, and for the first time since I'd known her, Melissa seemed genuinely vulnerable rather than performatively dramatic. "I want you to know that I tried to stop him. When I found out what he was doing with your college fund, I told him he had to replace it immediately, even if it meant canceling the wedding or selling his car or taking out loans against his business. But by then it was too late. The money was gone. If you knew he was stealing from me, why didn't you contact me directly? Why didn't you tell my mother or try to stop him some other way?" "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of losing him, afraid of admitting I'd gotten involved with someone who could do something like that. I convinced myself that he would find a way to fix it, that maybe you wouldn't need the money until later, that somehow it would work out." The conversation continued for another hour, with Melissa providing details about my father's financial situation that painted an even bleaker picture than I'd imagined. Not only was my college money gone, but he was in debt to online gambling sites, behind on his business expenses, and facing potential professional consequences if his clients discovered his financial instability. "Is there any chance the money could be recovered?" I asked finally. "No, it's gone, Emma. Even if he stopped gambling today and dedicated every dollar he earned to paying back what he owes, it would take years to clear his debts, and your college fund would be the last priority." When we parted ways, Melissa hugged me awkwardly and promised to send me documentation of my father's gambling activity that I could use if I needed to provide additional proof of my circumstances to Northwestern or legal authorities. "I'm sorry," she said as we stood next to our cars in the coffee shop parking lot. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am genuinely sorry that you got caught up in this mess." I drove home feeling strangely hollow, as if learning the full truth about my father's behavior had somehow made the situation both worse and more final. The money wasn't just spent on wedding expenses that could theoretically be returned or recovered. It was literally gone, fed into online gambling systems that had no mechanism for refunds or do-overs. But the conversation with Melissa had also clarified something important about my crowdfunding campaign and my approach to solving this problem. I wasn't just asking for help because my father had made poor choices about wedding expenses. I was asking for help because he was an addict who had systematically destroyed his family's financial security to feed his addiction. That night, I updated my crowdfunding campaign with carefully worded information about the additional circumstances I'd learned. I didn't include specifics about gambling or addiction, but I made it clear that the money taken from my college fund was unrecoverable, and that the situation was more complex than a simple disagreement about wedding expenses. The response to the updated information was immediate and positive. Donations increased significantly, and the comments section filled with messages from people who had personal experience with gambling addiction in their families and understood the specific kind of devastation it could cause. Within 3 days, my campaign had reached $25,000, more than halfway to my goal, with still 6 weeks before I needed to confirm my enrollment at Northwestern. But the success of the crowdfunding campaign was creating its own complications. The more attention my story received, the more it attracted people who wanted to help in ways that went beyond financial contributions. I received messages from lawyers offering to pursue civil action against my father, from addiction counselors suggesting family intervention strategies, from financial advisors proposing investment strategies for the money I was raising. Most significantly, I heard from a Northwestern alumnus named David Park, who had followed my story through social media and wanted to discuss other options for funding my education. David was in his 30s, a successful technology consultant who had graduated from Northwestern's business school and maintained active involvement in alumni activities. He reached out through the university's alumni network after hearing about my situation from Janet Morrison in the financial aid office. "I've been following your crowdfunding campaign," he said when we spoke by phone, "and I'm impressed by your resourcefulness and determination. But I also think there might be more sustainable ways to address your funding needs." He explained that he'd been looking for opportunities to invest in promising students through private educational sponsorship arrangements. Rather than simply donating money, he was interested in providing full tuition support in exchange for a formal agreement that I would pay back a percentage of my future earnings for a specified period after graduation. "It's essentially a private version of income share agreements that some schools are starting to offer," he explained. "You get your education funded without debt, and I get a return on investment tied to your career success. If you do well professionally, I benefit. If you struggle financially, my returns are limited accordingly." The proposal was intriguing but also complicated in ways that made me nervous. David was offering to pay my full tuition for 4 years, approximately $200,000, in exchange for 10% of my gross income for the first 15 years of my career after graduation. The math was potentially favorable depending on my career trajectory.
If I became a successful journalist earning significant income, David would recoup his investment and profit substantially. But if my income remained modest, he might never recover what he'd spent on my education. "Why would you take that risk with someone you've never met?" I asked. "Because I believe in investing in talent and potential rather than just providing charity. Your story demonstrates exactly the kind of resilience and determination that correlates with professional success. You've already shown you can overcome significant obstacles and find creative solutions to complex problems." He proposed a meeting with lawyers present to discuss the specific terms of such an arrangement, making it clear that this was a serious business proposal rather than an impulsive gesture of sympathy. The possibility was both exciting and overwhelming. If David's proposal was legitimate and fair, it could solve my college funding problem completely, eliminating the stress of crowdfunding campaigns and the uncertainty of cobbling together various aid sources. But it would also mean entering into a long-term financial relationship with a stranger, committing a decade and a half of my future earnings to someone whose motivations I didn't fully understand. I scheduled the meeting for the following week, knowing that I needed legal advice of my own before making any commitments. This was exactly the kind of decision my father should have been helping me navigate, the kind of complex financial choice where parental guidance and support would have been invaluable. Instead, I was 18 years old, making potentially life-altering financial decisions alone, while the person who should have been protecting my interests was busy destroying his own life through gambling addiction. The irony wasn't lost on me that my father's betrayal had forced me to become financially independent and responsible in ways that most teenagers never have to consider. I was learning to evaluate investment proposals and contractual obligations because the adult who should have been handling these responsibilities had abdicated them completely. As I prepared for the meeting with David Park and his lawyers, I realized that regardless of how his proposal worked out, I'd already changed in fundamental ways because of this experience. I was no longer the trusting daughter who assumed her parents would keep their promises and protect her interests. I was someone who read fine print, asked hard questions, and prepared for the possibility that the people who claimed to care about me might not act in my best interests when it mattered most. The law office smelled like leather and old money, the kind of place where serious decisions were made by people who charged by the hour. I sat across from David Park and his attorney, my own lawyer beside me, reviewing a contract that could define the next 15 years of my life. David's proposal was more generous than I'd expected. Full tuition coverage, plus living expenses for 4 years, in exchange for 8% of my income for 12 years after graduation. His lawyer had included protections I wouldn't have thought to request: caps on total repayment amounts, deferrals for unemployment or family emergencies, and early termination options if I chose graduate school or public service careers.
This is unusually favorable for the student, my attorney whispered during a break in negotiations. Most income share agreements I've seen are much more aggressive in their terms, but I was learning to question generous offers that seemed too good to be true. Why is he being so reasonable? What's the catch I'm not seeing? Honestly, I think he genuinely wants to help, and he has enough money that this is more about legacy than profit. Some wealthy people collect art, he's collecting success stories. The final detail that convinced me was David's request for quarterly progress reports during college. Not just grades, but updates on internships, career development, personal growth. He wanted to stay involved in my journey, invested in my success beyond just the financial returns. I've funded 3 other students through similar arrangements, he explained as we finalized the paperwork. 2 are thriving in their careers, 1 is struggling but showing progress. What I've learned is that the relationship matters as much as the money. I want to be a mentor, not just an investor. I signed the contract on a Thursday afternoon in May, 3 weeks before Northwestern's enrollment deadline. The relief was overwhelming, but it came with complex emotions I hadn't anticipated. Gratitude mixed with loss, excitement tempered by the recognition that this triumph existed only because my father had failed me so completely. That evening, I updated my crowdfunding campaign one final time, explaining that I'd secured alternative funding and encouraging donors to redirect their support to other students in need. The $32,000 I'd raised would be returned to contributors who requested it, or donated to Northwestern's emergency aid fund for students facing similar crises. The response to my final update surprised me. Instead of disappointment that their money wouldn't be needed, most donors expressed celebration that I'd found a solution. Many chose to let their contributions go to the emergency aid fund, creating a small scholarship that would help other students facing unexpected financial hardships. My father called the day after I posted the update, his voice carrying emotions I couldn't identify. "I heard you found funding for Northwestern," he said carefully. "I did, no thanks to you. Emma, I want you to know that I never intended for things to go this far. When I took that money, I honestly believed I could replace it before you needed it." His words felt hollow, rehearsed like something he'd practiced saying to make himself feel better rather than to actually communicate with me. "Your intentions don't matter anymore, Dad. What matters is that you taught me I can't rely on family when it really counts. That's not fair. I made mistakes, but I'm still your father. I still love you. Love isn't something you say, it's something you do. And what you did was choose your addiction and your girlfriend over your daughter's future." The conversation ended badly, as I'd known it would, but for the first time I felt like I'd said what needed to be said without anger clouding my words. I wasn't interested in punishing him or making him feel guilty. I just wanted him to understand that his choices had consequences beyond whatever personal struggles he was facing. Melissa had left him, just as she'd promised. Their wedding was canceled, their joint financial accounts closed, her children protected from whatever financial chaos he was still navigating. She'd sent me a message through social media thanking me for inspiring her to make that difficult decision. "Watching you fight for your future made me realize I needed to fight for mine too," she wrote. "I'm sorry it took your strength to show me what mine should look like." Northwestern's orientation week in late August felt like stepping into a parallel universe where my college fund had never been stolen, where my father's gambling addiction was someone else's family tragedy, where 18-year-olds could focus on choosing majors and making friends instead of navigating complex financial contracts. But I'd learned that surviving betrayal changes you in ways that can't be undone. I was more cautious about trust, more aware of financial realities, more appreciative of genuine support when I found it. These weren't necessarily bad changes, but they were permanent ones. David kept his promise about mentorship. We met monthly throughout my freshman year, discussing not just my academic progress, but career planning, internship opportunities, professional networking. He introduced me to journalists and media executives, helped me secure summer positions that would have been impossible to access otherwise. "Your story isn't over," he reminded me during one of our meetings. "What happened with your father was a chapter, not the whole book. How you respond to it, what you build from it, that's what defines your story." He was right, but the chapter wasn't quite finished yet. During spring break of my sophomore year, I received a call from a bankruptcy attorney representing my father. He'd filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, liquidating his accounting practice and personal assets to address debts that had grown beyond any possibility of repayment. Your father wanted me to contact you because there's a small asset recovery that belongs to you, the attorney explained. When we liquidated his business accounts, we found a separate account with about $12,000 that appears to be remainder funds from your original college account. I was quiet for a long moment, processing the irony. He wants to give me $12,000 now. He specifically requested that any recovered funds be directed to you rather than included in the general asset pool for creditors. It's not much compared to what was originally taken, but he felt you should have it. The money arrived 2 weeks later with a letter from my father that I almost didn't open. When I finally did, I found 3 pages of handwriting that looked like it had been written and rewritten multiple times. Emma, it began, I know money can't repair what I broke between us, but I wanted you to have what little I could save from the wreckage I created. This isn't an attempt to buy forgiveness or make myself feel better about choices that can't be undone. I've been in gambling addiction treatment for 6 months now, working with counselors who've helped me understand how completely I lost perspective on what mattered. They've taught me that addiction explanations aren't excuses, that understanding why I did destructive things doesn't eliminate the responsibility for the damage I caused. I destroyed your trust, stole your security, and forced you to become financially independent years before you should have needed those skills. I'm proud of how you've handled this impossible situation, but I'm devastated that my failures created the need for your strength. I don't expect you to forgive me or include me in your life going forward. I just want you to know that watching you succeed despite what I did has been the only bright spot in the worst period of my life. You're an extraordinary person, not because of anything I taught you, but because of who you chose to become when tested. The $12,000 isn't payment for what I took. It's a small acknowledgement that you deserved better from the person who should have protected your dreams instead of threatening them. I read the letter 3 times, then put it away for several weeks before deciding what to do with the money and the complicated emotions it represented. Finally, I used it to establish the Emma Chen Emergency Education Fund at Northwestern, specifically designated for students whose families had experienced financial crises or betrayals that threatened their educational opportunities. The fund wasn't large enough to provide full scholarships, but it could offer emergency grants for students facing sudden changes in family support. I didn't tell my father what I'd done with the money, but I included information about the fund in my final letter to him. Dad, I wrote, I'm using your $12,000 to help other students who find themselves in situations similar to what you put me in. It seems like the most productive way to transform your mistakes into something meaningful. I don't hate you, but I also can't pretend that our relationship can return to what it was before. Trust, once broken completely, doesn't repair itself just because people feel sorry for breaking it. Maybe someday we'll find a different kind of relationship, but that will depend on who you become in recovery, not who you promise to be in letters. I hope you find peace with yourself and build a life that doesn't hurt the people around you. But I won't be part of that process. I have my own life to build, and I've learned to do that without expecting protection or support from people who've proven they can't provide it. I never sent the letter, writing it was enough. 4 years later, I graduated from Northwestern with a journalism degree and job offers from 3 major newspapers. David attended my graduation, sitting with my mother and grandparents in the family section, having earned his place there through consistent support rather than biological connection. 12% of your income for 8 more years, he reminded me jokingly as we celebrated at dinner afterward. Best investment I ever made, but we both knew the relationship had evolved beyond the financial contract. He'd become the mentor and father figure my actual father should have been, demonstrating what adult support looked like when it was offered freely rather than manipulated for personal benefit. My career flourished over the following years. I worked for major newspapers, won regional journalism awards, eventually became an investigative reporter specializing in financial fraud cases. The skills I'd developed navigating my father's betrayal, the skepticism about financial promises that seemed too good to be true, served me well in exposing white-collar criminals who exploited others' trust. 10 years after graduation, I made my final payment to David, 8 years ahead of schedule. My income had exceeded both our expectations, and I wanted to close that chapter of dependence, even though it had been positive dependence. I'm proud of who you've become, he said when I handed him the final check. But I'm especially proud that you didn't let what happened with your father make you cynical about accepting help when it's genuinely offered. He was right. I'd learned to distinguish between manipulation disguised as generosity and authentic support offered without strings. The difference was in the consistency, the respect for boundaries, the absence of guilt or obligation as tools of control. I never spoke to my father again after that final letter I didn't send. I heard through family members that he'd maintained his sobriety, rebuilt a modest accounting practice, and eventually remarried someone who apparently helped him stay grounded in reality rather than fantasy. I was glad he'd found stability, but I felt no obligation to celebrate his recovery or include him in my success. Some betrayals are so fundamental that they change the nature of relationships permanently, not because forgiveness is impossible, but because trust is too damaged to support the weight of ongoing connection. My mother and I grew closer through the experience, bonded by the recognition that we'd both had to rebuild our understanding of family and support systems. She'd learned to be financially independent in ways the divorce had never forced her to consider. I'd learned that family was something you created through choice and consistency, not something you inherited through genetics. The Emma Chen Emergency Education Fund grew over the years as my career provided increasing ability to contribute to it. Other donors joined, many of them people who'd followed my original crowdfunding campaign and wanted to support similar students facing family financial crises. Last month, I received a letter from a student named Marcus Williams, whose parents had used his college fund to prevent foreclosure on their home. He'd received an emergency grant from my fund that allowed him to continue his engineering studies, despite the sudden loss of expected family support. Thank you for understanding that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect our futures are the ones who end up threatening them, he wrote. Your fund didn't just provide money, it provided hope that other people's failures don't have to define our possibilities. Reading his letter, I realized that my father's betrayal had ultimately created something positive that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Not because what he did was acceptable or forgivable, but because surviving it had taught me that strength isn't about avoiding damage. It's about transforming damage into something useful for yourself and others. I kept Marcus's letter on my desk, next to a photo from my Northwestern graduation, a reminder that sometimes the best response to betrayal is building something beautiful enough to make the pain worthwhile. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.